The Wild West wasn't just violent, it was strange, disturbing, and in some cases so dark that the details got quietly buried for over a century. Not because they were boring, but because they didn't fit the myth Hollywood was selling. Some of what you're about to hear was left out of textbooks on purpose. Some of it was simply too uncomfortable to print. Every single case here is documented, and once you hear it, you'll never watch a Western the same way again. Picture a town square on a Sunday afternoon. Families in their best clothes, children eating candy, and a rope hanging from a wooden beam. In several frontier towns, hangings weren't hidden behind prison walls. They were scheduled events. Local newspapers printed the date and time in advance like a theater listing. Vendors sold food along the crowd line. Some towns even sold tickets to guarantee a front row view. Nobody called it barbaric at the time. It was considered proof that justice had been served. But the disturbing part, historians rarely mention, is that a portion of the men executed this way never received anything resembling a fair trial. Photographs from several of these events survive today, showing well-dressed crowds smiling for the camera as if they were posing outside a church, a detail that still unsettles historians who study the images now. In many boomtowns, brothels weren't hidden in back alleys. They operated in plain sight, often just a block from the sheriff's office, because they were one of the only reliable sources of tax revenue in a town with no industry. Local law enforcement frequently collected licensing fees directly from madams, essentially making prostitution a state-sanctioned business rather than a crime. Some sheriffs even patrolled these houses personally to prevent violence against the women working there, not out of pure kindness, but because a dead woman was bad for business. The arrangement kept the peace, kept the taxes flowing, and kept the whole system quietly running for decades. In some towns, brothel taxes made up a larger share of municipal income than any other single source, which meant closing them down would have bankrupted the very government trying to look respectable. Out on the frontier, men outnumbered women by a staggering margin, sometimes 10-to-1 in remote mining regions. To fix that, newspapers ran classified ads where women back east described themselves and what they wanted in a husband, and lonely men wrote back with proposals, sometimes sight unseen. Marriages were arranged entirely through letters, and the first time bride and groom actually met was often the day of the wedding. There was no vetting process, no background check, nothing stopping a violent or already married man from placing an ad under a false name. Many of these marriages worked out. A disturbing number did not, and there was almost nowhere for a woman to turn once she arrived. Sometimes hundreds of miles from the nearest relative and completely dependent on a man she had known only through a handful of letters. Chinese laborers who built the Transcontinental Railroad brought opium smoking with them, and it spread quickly among miners, cowboys, and even respectable townsfolk looking for an escape. Opium dens operated openly in cities like Deadwood, Tombstone, and San Francisco, often just steps from the saloon. Addiction spread fast because nobody understood it as addiction. It was simply seen as a habit, no different than drinking too much whiskey. Local law enforcement mostly left the dens alone as long as the owners paid their fees, which meant an entire generation of frontier workers quietly slipped into dependency with zero medical understanding of what was happening to them. Some towns eventually passed laws banning opium dens specifically, but the wording targeted only Chinese-owned establishments, leaving the habit itself untouched wherever a white proprietor happened to be running the room. Family survival on the frontier often depended on every able body working, and that included children. In many mining towns, boys as young as 8 crawled into narrow shafts too small for adult miners, sorting rock and hauling debris for pennies a day. There were no labor laws protecting them, no safety regulations, and cave-ins killed children just as easily as adults. Parents weren't cruel for allowing it. Starvation was the alternative. This detail rarely makes it into Old West films because it doesn't fit the image of rugged individual freedom the genre is built on. Company ledgers from several mining operations list child workers by first name only, paid a fraction of an adult wage for the exact same hours underground. In towns without functioning courts, self-appointed groups called vigilance committees took justice into their own hands, and they did it often. These committees operated with zero legal authority. Yet, in several documented territories, they hanged more accused men in a single year than official courts did in a decade. Membership was usually secret, verdicts were decided in minutes, and there was no appeal. Some vigilance committees genuinely stopped violent criminals. Others were used to eliminate business rivals, settle personal grudges, or intimidate anyone the group simply didn't like. Nobody kept the two apart, and nobody was ever punished for getting it wrong. In one well-documented territory, a single vigilance committee reportedly hanged more men in 18 months than the entire regional court system processed in the following 10 years combined. Starting in the late 1870s, the U.S. government began systematically removing Native children from their families and placing them in boarding schools designed to strip away their language, culture, and identity. Hair was cut, Native names were replaced, and speaking a tribal language could result in punishment. These schools were framed publicly as education and opportunity. In reality, disease, malnutrition, and abuse were common, and a documented number of children never returned home at all. This policy ran for decades and was treated at the time as a humane alternative to conflict, which shows just how differently humane was defined back then. In one of the darkest chapters rarely discussed openly, several territorial governments placed bounties on Native American scalps during periods of conflict, paying set amounts per scalp regardless of age or gender. This turned violence into a commercial transaction and incentivized attacks on undefended communities rather than combatants. The practice existed alongside official military campaigns and was, for a period, entirely legal under territorial law. It is one of the clearest examples of how the frontier's brutality wasn't always chaotic and lawless. Mothers dosed teething infants with morphine syrup to quiet them through the night. Addiction rates climbed quietly across the frontier. Hidden inside what people believed was ordinary medicine, nobody connected the dots for years because the substances were legal, doctor-endorsed, and sold right next to the flour and sugar. Advertisements from the period proudly claimed these tonics would make a fussy baby quiet as an angel, with no mention anywhere on the label of what was actually inside the bottle. In several Western states, laws explicitly barred Chinese immigrants from testifying against white citizens in criminal cases. This meant that if a white man assaulted, robbed, or even killed a Chinese laborer, there was often no legal path to prosecute him, because the only witnesses were legally silenced by their race. Violence against Chinese communities during this period went almost entirely unpunished as a direct result. Entire Chinatowns were burned in documented massacres with no convictions to follow, and the legal system wasn't broken by accident. It was built that way on purpose, and legal scholars today point to these statutes as some of the clearest documented proof that frontier law wasn't blind to race, it was written around it. Robbery wasn't always a desperate act by a lone criminal. In several documented cases, respected local businessmen quietly financed outlaw gangs, providing information about shipment schedules or bank vulnerabilities in exchange for a cut of the take. These men kept clean public reputations while privately funding the very crimes local law enforcement was supposedly hunting down. It made prosecuting certain gangs nearly impossible since the people with the power to investigate sometimes had a financial stake in looking the other way. Frontier law overwhelmingly favored husbands, and in most territories a woman needed to prove extreme cruelty, abandonment, or adultery with witnesses just to be granted a divorce. Physical abuse alone was often not considered sufficient grounds unless it was severe and documented, which was nearly impossible in isolated homesteads with no neighbors for miles. Many women simply had no legal way out of dangerous marriages. A small number ran, changing their names and starting over hundreds of miles away, which was one of the only real options available. Court records from the period show judges routinely siding with husbands even when neighbors testified to visible injuries, simply because the legal bar for proven cruelty was set deliberately high. Many mining and railroad companies paid workers in scrip, a form of company-issued currency that could only be spent at stores the company itself owned. Prices at these stores were inflated far above market rate, which meant workers were often trapped in a cycle of debt to their own employer no matter how hard they worked. Leaving town wasn't simple either, since a worker in debt to the company store could be legally detained until the balance was paid. It was, in practice, a form of bonded labor operating under a completely legal business structure. And the phrase, owing your soul to the company store, became common enough that it later found its way into folk songs written decades after the practice quietly faded out. Medical schools needed cadavers for anatomy training, and legal sources were scarce, so a black market in stolen corpses thrived across frontier towns. Resurrection men, as they were called, dug up freshly buried bodies at night and sold them to medical colleges for a fee, no questions asked. Families sometimes hired guards to watch over graves for weeks after burial, specifically to prevent this. The practice was common enough that certain cemeteries built iron cages called mort safes directly over graves, a detail that still exists in a few preserved frontier cemeteries today. In the earliest boomtowns, gold or silver would be discovered, thousands of people would arrive within weeks, and no government structure existed at all. No police, no courts, no mayor, nothing. These towns ran on unofficial codes agreed upon by miners themselves, sometimes literally voted on in a public meeting the first week the camp existed. It worked surprisingly well in some places, and completely collapsed into chaos in others, depending entirely on who showed up first, and how much everyone agreed to police themselves. Some of these self-governed camps lasted years before a territorial government ever bothered to send an official, by which point the town had already written and enforced its own rules from scratch. Long before forensic toxicology existed, poison was a remarkably safe way to eliminate a rival, an abusive spouse, or business partner. Arsenic in particular was cheap, tasteless, and produced symptoms that mimicked common frontier illnesses like cholera or dysentery. Without any way to test for it, countless deaths that were quietly murders were recorded simply as sickness. Historians estimate the true number of poisoning deaths from this era will never be known, because the entire crime was designed to look exactly like something that already killed people constantly. It wasn't until forensic chemistry improved decades later that investigators could even begin to re-examine old cases, by which point most of the evidence and the people involved were long gone. Black cavalry regiments known as Buffalo Soldiers protected settlers, built roads, and fought in dozens of frontier campaigns, often with fewer supplies and worse equipment than white regiments doing identical work. Despite consistently strong service records, they were routinely denied promotions available to white soldiers and faced open hostility, even from the settlers they were assigned to protect. Their contribution to securing the frontier is now well documented. But for decades, it was almost entirely left out of the popular Western narrative built around white cavalry heroes. Some accounts suggest the nickname itself was given by native warriors, who respected their tenacity in battle, a detail the soldiers reportedly wore with pride, despite everything stacked against them. In several documented frontier cases, husbands committed their wives to asylums not for genuine mental illness, but because the law made it remarkably easy to do so with minimal evidence, and it conveniently removed a woman who was inconvenient, outspoken, or simply wanted a divorce. Once committed, a woman had almost no legal path to challenge the diagnosis or secure her own release. Some spent years institutionalized for nothing more than disagreeing with their husbands in public, a detail that reveals just how little legal protection women actually had. Release, when it happened at all, usually required a male relative to formally vouch for her, meaning the same family structure that committed her was often the only door out. The Homestead Act promised free land to anyone willing to farm it, but wealthy speculators exploited legal loopholes on a massive scale, hiring fake claimants to file paperwork on their behalf, and then quietly consolidating thousands of acres meant for individual families. Genuine homesteaders often arrived to find the best land already tied up in fraudulent filings, forcing them onto marginal ground with worse soil and less water. The system built to democratize land ownership ended up concentrating huge amounts of it in the hands of people who never intended to farm a single acre. Federal land offices, understaffed and hundreds of miles from the claims they were supposed to verify, simply couldn't keep up with the volume of fraudulent paperwork flooding in every month. Among the darker, documented incidents of the frontier era, at least one case exists of blankets from a smallpox ward being deliberately given to Native American communities during a period of conflict, with the explicit intention of spreading disease as a weapon. The tactic exploited the fact that Native populations had no prior immunity to European diseases, making the outcome devastating and rapid. This incident is confirmed through military correspondence from the period, making it one of the most disturbing documented examples of biological warfare in American history. Historians continue to debate how widespread the tactic actually was, but the surviving letters alone are enough to confirm it happened at least once, deliberately, and with full knowledge of the outcome. Convict leasing programs allowed states to rent out prisoners to private companies for railroad construction, mining, and road building, often for little to no pay to the prisoners themselves. Conditions were frequently worse than plantation labor before it, with high injury and death rates that went largely unreported since prisoners had no advocates and no public sympathy. The system disproportionately targeted black men arrested on minor or fabricated charges specifically to funnel them into forced labor, a pattern historians now recognize as slavery continuing under a different legal label. Some counties reportedly relied on the fees paid by companies leasing prisoners as a primary source of government revenue, giving local officials a direct financial incentive to keep arrest numbers high. Long before anyone coined the term fake news, frontier newspapers frequently printed invented stories to sell copies, entertain readers, or embarrass a rival paper across town. Fabricated gunfights, invented monster sightings, and exaggerated outlaw exploits ran as straight news with no disclaimer. Readers often had no way to verify anything printed hundreds of miles from where an event supposedly happened, and many of the wildest legends associated with the Old West today trace directly back to newspaper fiction that was never corrected. Some editors later admitted, decades after the fact, that entire front-page stories had been written from a bar stool with no reporting done at all. When valuable resources like gold, silver, or fertile farmland were discovered on land legally recognized as native territory, treaties were routinely broken or renegotiated under pressure, and entire communities were relocated by force, sometimes with only days of notice. These relocations were framed publicly as necessary and even generous, offering supposedly equivalent land elsewhere. In reality, the replacement land was almost always worse, and the pattern repeated so consistently across different territories that it functioned less like isolated incidents and more like standard federal policy. Descendants of several relocated communities still hold formal land claims today, over a century later, in disputes that remain unresolved in federal court. While lynching in the American West is often associated primarily with cattle thieves or outlaws, historical records show Mexican and Chinese residents were lynched at disproportionately high rates relative to their population, frequently over disputes involving land, labor, or simple accusations with no real evidence behind them. These killings rarely resulted in any prosecution, and local newspapers often reported them with little more concern than a minor news item. The scale of this violence has only been fully documented by historians in recent decades, using court records, newspaper archives, and coroner's reports that sat largely unexamined for over 100 years. Traveling medicine shows promised miracle cures for everything from baldness to cancer, and some products marketed in the later frontier period actually contained trace radioactive substances, sold under the belief that radiation itself was a health tonic. Buyers had no way of knowing the difference between a harmless placebo and something that would slowly poison them over years of regular use. Regulation didn't exist to stop any of it, which meant an entire industry of confident salesmen profited freely from products nobody had tested for safety. Some of these radioactive tonics were sold for years after early scientists had already begun privately warning that radiation exposure carried serious risks, warnings that never made it past the marketing department. When frontier miners and railroad workers organized strikes over dangerous conditions or unpaid wages, companies frequently hired private armed guards who operated with near total legal immunity, even when confrontations turned fatal. Several documented strikes ended with guards opening fire on unarmed workers, and prosecutions were exceedingly rare, since local law enforcement was often funded or influenced by the same companies. Labor organizing on the frontier was, in practice, a genuinely dangerous act, with real legal risk stacked entirely against the workers. Newspapers owned by the same industrialists often reported these incidents as the guards defending themselves, regardless of who had actually fired the first shot. Between the 1850s and early 1900s, charitable organizations in eastern cities placed orphaned or abandoned children on trains headed west, where they were essentially handed off to whichever family showed up at each stop and expressed interest. Now, there was minimal to no background screening of the families receiving these children, and outcomes varied wildly, from genuinely loving adoptive homes to situations of unpaid child labor with no oversight whatsoever. An estimated hundreds of thousands of children passed through the system with almost no consistent record keeping to track what actually happened to them. Siblings were frequently separated at different train stops with no promise, and often no real attempt to reunite them later in life. In several frontier territories, appointed governors treated their position less like public service and more like a business opportunity, awarding land grants, mining rights, and government contracts to family members or business partners in exchange for private payments. Oversight from the federal government hundreds of miles away was minimal to non-existent, which meant corruption could run for years before anyone in Washington took notice, and even then, consequences were rare. A handful of governors were eventually recalled, but most simply resigned quietly, kept their fortunes, and moved on to their next appointment elsewhere. With no separate juvenile justice system in most territories, children as young as 10 who were arrested for minor offenses like theft were frequently housed in the same cells as violent adult offenders, with no protection provided and no distinction made in sentencing. Reform movements pushing for separate juvenile facilities didn't gain meaningful traction in most Western territories until well after the frontier era had already closed, meaning an entire generation of children experienced adult incarceration with all its dangers intact, a reality that stands in sharp contrast to the clean, almost innocent version of frontier justice most Western films still choose to portray. After everything, all the violence, exploitation, and lawlessness documented here, the Old West didn't end with a dramatic final showdown. It ended quietly in 1893, when historian Frederick Jackson Turner stood before an audience at the Chicago World's Fair and explained that the 1890 census had already recorded something nobody had noticed. There was no longer a continuous, unsettled frontier line anywhere in the country. The era that shaped so much of American identity and hid so much of what actually happened simply ended with a paragraph of statistics and a lecture nobody in the moment realized was history closing its own door.